Imagine finding a dying creature, abandoned by those who should have protected it. Would you have the courage to become the hero no one else was willing to be? Today's story will challenge everything you think you know about courage, compassion, and what one person can accomplish. Prepare yourself for an incredibly moving tale of survival and hope that will leave you in tears. A true story of extraordinary compassion from rural Virginia. The rain had been falling relentlessly for 3 days straight, turning the roadside ditches of Shenandoah County into muddy rivers. It was on one such miserable April morning that 17-year-old Mason Reynolds was taking his usual shortcut to school, hunched against the downpour when a sound stopped him cold. A whimper so faint it was nearly lost in the drumming of raindrops against his hood. Most teenagers would have continued walking, already running late for first period, phones buzzing with messages from friends wondering where they were. But there was something about Mason that set him apart. Perhaps it was the loss he'd experienced 2 years earlier when his father passed away suddenly, or maybe it was simply his inherent kindness that his mother had nurtured, despite their financial struggles. The ditch beside the country road was swollen with muddy water, trash collecting in the eddies, discarded fast food containers, plastic bottles, the detritus of humans who couldn't be bothered to care. That's when Elijah spotted something that didn't belong among the garbage. A patch of dirty golden fur barely visible above the rising water, trembling with each labored breath. What he found would haunt his dreams for months to come. A young golden retriever, no more than a year old, lying in the filthy water with both back legs twisted at unnatural angles. The dog's once beautiful coat was matted with mud, blood, and what looked like motor oil, as if someone had not only broken this innocent creature's legs, but had purposely dumped automotive waste on him before leaving him to die a slow, agonizing death. The dog's eyes were what struck Mason the hardest, warm amber pools filled with a pain no animal should ever know, yet somehow still holding a flicker of hope as they met the teenager's gaze. There was no collar, no identification, just a living being who had been betrayed in the worst way possible by the humans who were supposed to protect him. Mason's heart pounded as he carefully waded into the ditch, the cold water soaking through his jeans. "Hey, buddy," he whispered, trying to keep his voice steady despite the rage and sorrow threatening to overwhelm him. "I'm going to help you, okay? I'm not going to hurt you." The dog didn't growl or bare his teeth. He simply watched, as if assessing whether this human would be like the last. The nearest animal hospital was in Winchester, 20 miles away, and Mason had precisely $37 to his name, money he'd been saving for weeks to buy his mother a birthday present. He had no car, no real resources, and was about to miss an important test in his AP biology class that could affect his scholarship chances. For a brief, shameful moment, Mason considered walking away, calling animal control and hoping they'd arrive before the water rose any higher. After all, what could one high school student with no money really do? But then the dog did something that made the decision for him. Despite what must have been excruciating pain, he tried to wag his tail, just the slightest movement, a broken gesture of trust that brought tears to Mason's eyes. Jennifer Reynolds had raised her son alone since her husband died of cancer, working double shifts at the local diner to keep their small house and put food on the table. She had taught Mason that character wasn't measured by what you did when things were easy, but by the choices you made when doing the right thing cost you something. With gentle hands, Mason removed his rain jacket and carefully wrapped it around the trembling dog, mindful of the broken legs. "I've got you now," he murmured, his decision made. "No one's going to hurt you again." The dog weighed more than Elijah expected, and his muscles strained as he lifted the injured animal from the ditch, mud and water soaking through his school clothes. Mrs. Peterson, Mason's elderly neighbor, had often mentioned how her late husband had been a veterinarian before his passing 5 years ago. She still kept his old medical room intact behind their house, a place Mason had glimpsed once when helping her carry groceries filled with equipment gathering dust and memories. The town of Millwood, Virginia wasn't known for much, a population just under 3,000, a main street with more closed businesses than open ones, and a tight-knit community where everyone knew everyone else's business. It was the kind of place where tragedies were felt collectively, but also where small miracles sometimes occurred when people came together. As Mason trudged through the rain, the injured dog cradled against his chest. He had no way of knowing that this moment, this simple act of refusing to walk past suffering, would not only change the course of his life forever, but would spark a chain of events that would eventually transform their entire community. All he knew was that the heartbeat against his own was growing fainter, and he needed to hurry. Mrs. Peterson answered her door in a faded floral robe, her silver hair still in curlers, eyes widening at the sight of the soaked teenager cradling the broken animal. "Good Lord, Mason!" she exclaimed, quickly ushering him inside without a second thought about the mud and water dripping onto her immaculate floor. What in heaven's name happened? Her weathered hands reached for the dog instinctively, decades of being a veterinarian's wife evident in her gentle touch. "Found him in the ditch by Willow Creek Road," Mason explained breathlessly, his arms trembling from the strain of carrying the golden retriever for nearly a mile. "Someone just left him there to die." His voice cracked on the last word, the enormity of the cruelty finally hitting him now that he was somewhere safe. "His legs are broken, Mrs. Peterson. Both of them, and I think he's been out there a while." The dog's breathing had grown more labored during the journey, each shallow rise and fall of his chest, a battle that seemed to require more effort than the last. His fur was cold to the touch despite the warm spring morning, and when Mrs. Peterson carefully peeled back Mason's soaked jacket, the true extent of the dog's injuries became painfully clear in the harsh kitchen light. Not just broken legs, but deep lacerations along his side, patches of missing fur, and what appeared to be cigarette burns dotting his muzzle. "This wasn't an accident," Mrs. Peterson whispered, her voice hard with a rare anger as she guided Mason toward the small building behind her house where her husband had once treated local pets. Someone did this deliberately. The realization hung in the air between them, too horrible to fully process, that a human being had systematically tortured this animal before discarding him like trash, leaving him to drown in a roadside ditch when they grew bored with their cruelty. The old veterinary office smelled of dust and disuse, but Mrs. Peterson moved through it with the familiarity of someone revisiting a cherished memory. She flipped switches and ancient fluorescent lights flickered to life, illuminating examination tables, cabinets full of supplies, and walls lined with certificates and faded photographs of Dr. Peterson with his animal patients. "It's been years since anyone used this place," she said softly, "but Robert always kept everything in perfect order." Mason's phone buzzed incessantly in his pocket. First period had already started, then second, but he silenced it without looking at the messages. His mother would be furious when the school called about his absence, especially with final exams approaching and his scholarship hanging in the balance. For a family barely making ends meet, that college scholarship represented everything: security, opportunity, a chance to break the cycle of financial struggle that had defined their lives. "I need to get some fluids in him immediately," Mrs. Peterson said, slipping into a role she must have played countless times alongside her husband. "There's an IV kit in that drawer over there, and grab those blankets from the cabinet. We need to warm him up slowly." She spoke with quiet authority, transforming from a lonely widow into someone with purpose, someone who knew exactly what to do in the face of suffering. The golden retriever lay motionless on the examination table, his only sign of life the shallow, irregular breathing and occasional flicker of his eyelids when Mason stroked his head. "Hey, buddy," the teenager whispered, trying to keep his voice steady. "You're going to be okay now. We're going to help you." The dog's tail twitched slightly at the sound of his voice, the faintest response, but enough to make Mason's eyes burn with fresh tears. "I can stabilize him. Get some fluids and antibiotics started," Mrs. Peterson explained as she worked, her hands moving with surprising dexterity for someone in her 70s. "But these fractures need proper veterinary care, Mason. X-rays, probably surgery." And she hesitated, her eyes meeting his over the broken animal between them. "And that kind of care costs money, a lot of money." The reality of their situation settled over the room like a heavy blanket. They had rescued the dog from immediate danger, only to face an even greater challenge. The nearest animal hospital was 20 miles away in Winchester, and veterinary care for injuries this severe would cost thousands of dollars neither of them had. Mrs. Peterson lived on a fixed income, and Mason's family struggled to keep the electricity on some months. "There's the animal shelter in Berryville," Mrs. Peterson suggested carefully, though her tone made it clear what she thought of that option. They might be able to help, but with injuries this severe, she didn't need to finish the sentence. They both knew that overcrowded, underfunded shelters often couldn't afford expensive medical treatments for animals with poor prospects of adoption. Euthanasia would be the most likely outcome. Mason's fingers gently stroked the dog's filthy golden fur, still matted with mud from the ditch. "What if we called Dr. Martins?" he asked suddenly, recalling the veterinarian who had treated his neighbor's horse after an accident last summer. Maybe he could help us figure something out, or at least tell us what to do next. It was a desperate idea, but anything seemed better than giving up on the dog who had fought so hard to stay alive. Mrs. Peterson nodded slowly, reaching for her old rotary phone and dialing a number from memory. While she spoke in hushed tones to someone on the other end, Mason continued to comfort the dog, who had begun to shiver despite the blankets wrapped around him. "I'm going to call you Lucky," he whispered, the name coming to him suddenly, "because that's what you are. Lucky I found you, and lucky we're going to get you through this." As if in response to his new name, the dog, Lucky, opened his eyes fully for the first time since being brought into the clinic. They were still clouded with pain, but there was something else there now, something that made Mason's chest tighten with emotion. It wasn't just pain or fear in those amber eyes, but a cautious question, as if the dog was asking whether this human could really be trusted after what others had done to him. Mrs. Peterson returned, her expression a complex mixture of hope and concern. "Dr. Martins can see him this afternoon," she announced, "but he was very clear about the costs, Mason. The examination alone will be $150, and any treatment will be much more. X-rays, setting the fractures, medication, we're talking thousands of dollars, and even then, there's no guarantee he'll walk normally again." Mason sat on the edge of the examination table, Lucky's head resting against his leg. As he stared at his phone screen, the calculator app opened with numbers that refused to add up to anything hopeful. $37 in his wallet, $82 in his savings account, and a mother who was already working double shifts to keep them afloat. The weight of impossibility pressed down on his shoulders, but when he looked at Lucky's trusting eyes, he knew he couldn't give up. "I've got to call my mum," he finally said to Mrs. Peterson, who was adjusting the makeshift IV drip she had rigged from her husband's old supplies. His thumb hovered over Jennifer Reynolds' contact information, knowing that what he was about to ask would seem impossible to a woman who counted every penny and sacrificed everything for his future. The phone rang 3 times before his mother's tired voice answered, the ambient noise of the diner where she worked buzzing in the background. The conversation went exactly as Mason had feared. His mother's initial concern about him missing school quickly gave way to disbelief and then frustration as he explained about Lucky. "Mason, honey, I understand you want to help this dog, but we can barely afford your graduation expenses," she said. Her voice strained with the effort of being gentle when she was clearly at her wit's end. "The animal shelter is the right place for him. They're equipped to handle these situations." "They'll put him down, Mum," Mason replied, his voice cracking as he stroked Lucky's ear, the dog leaning into his touch despite the pain he must have been feeling. "He doesn't deserve that after everything he's been through. Someone hurt him on purpose and left him to die." The silence on the other end of the line stretched out, filled only by the distant clatter of dishes and his mother's weary sigh, the sound of a woman who had no more miracles to give. What Jennifer Reynolds said next would stay with Mason forever, a moment when his mother's true character revealed itself despite their difficult circumstances. "I can't give you permission to spend money we don't have," she began slowly, "but I've always taught you to stand by your convictions. If you believe this dog deserves a chance, then you need to find a way to make that happen. Just know that I can't help financially. We're behind on the electric bill as it is." Mrs. Peterson watched as Mason ended the call, his expression a mixture of determination and despair. "My mum basically said it's up to me," he explained, slipping the phone back into his pocket. "But she can't help with money, and I only have about $120 total." The sum hung in the air between them, almost laughably inadequate compared to the thousands they would need. "Well then," Mrs. Peterson said after a moment, pulling up a chair and sitting down with a groan as her arthritic knees protested, "we need to think creatively. In my day, when someone in the community needed help, we didn't just throw up our hands and give up. We found a way." There was a steely glint in her faded blue eyes that reminded Mason that this gentle elderly woman had survived the loss of her husband, outlived 2 of her children, and still managed to wake up each morning with purpose. The idea came to Mason like a bolt of lightning, so suddenly that he nearly startled Lucky with his excitement. "Social media," he exclaimed, already pulling out his phone again. "We could tell Lucky's story online, share pictures, maybe set up one of those fundraising pages I've seen people use after accidents or for medical bills." His fingers flew across the screen, opening Instagram, where his modest following of schoolmates and local friends might not seem like much, but it was a start. Mrs. Peterson looked skeptical but didn't discourage him. "I suppose it's worth a try," she said, adjusting her glasses to peer at his phone screen. "My granddaughter is always talking about things going viral, whatever that means. Do you really think people would donate money to help a dog they've never met?" The question wasn't cynical, but genuinely curious, coming from someone who had grown up in an era where community meant the people you could see face to face. While Lucky dozed fitfully under the effects of the pain medication Mrs. Peterson had carefully measured out, Mason took photos that told the story without words. The mangled legs, the cigarette burns, the trusting eyes that somehow still held hope. He wrote from his heart, describing finding Lucky in the ditch, the struggle to save him, and the impossible choice they now faced without funds for proper veterinary care. "I'm not asking for myself," Mason typed as he created the fundraising page, tears blurring his vision as he worked. "I'm asking for a dog who has already suffered more than any living being should have to endure. Lucky deserves a second chance at life, a chance to know what it means to be loved and cared for, not abandoned and abused. Any amount helps. Even $1 brings us closer to getting him the surgery he needs." With trembling fingers, he pressed post and sent Lucky's story out into the digital world, with no idea whether anyone would care or respond. Mrs. Peterson had dozed off in her chair, exhausted by the morning's events, and Lucky slept restlessly on the table, his broken body fighting battles that neither of them could see. All they could do now was wait and hope that somewhere, someone would be moved enough to help. What happened next would later be described by the local newspaper as a testament to the power of community in the digital age. Mason's post, shared first by his high school friends, then by their parents, began to spread beyond the borders of their small town. A local news station's social media manager spotted the story and shared it on their official page, and suddenly Lucky's battered face was appearing on screens across Virginia. By the time Dr. Martins arrived at Mrs. Peterson's house that afternoon, having rearranged his schedule to come to them when he learned they had no transportation, Mason's phone was buzzing constantly with notifications. The fundraising page, which had started with a modest goal of $2,000, had already reached $500 in just 4 hours, with donations coming in from places as far away as California and even Canada. Dr. Martins, a tall man with kind eyes and a gentle touch cultivated over decades of working with animals, examined Lucky thoroughly, while Mason and Mrs. Peterson watched anxiously. "Both tibias are fractured," he confirmed grimly, "and there's significant soft tissue damage consistent with abuse. He's also malnourished and has an infection starting in some of these wounds." He looked up at them, his expression serious, but not without hope. "He needs surgery, proper wound care, and a long recovery, but with the right treatment he could make it." The next 3 days passed in a blur of activity that transformed Mrs. Peterson's quiet home into the center of an unexpected movement. Dr. Martins had stabilized Lucky's condition and arranged for an emergency surgery at his clinic in Winchester, amazed by the outpouring of support that continued to flood Mason's fundraiser. By the morning of the surgery, they had raised over $7,000, more than enough to cover Lucky's immediate medical needs and begin a fund for his long-term recovery. Jennifer Reynolds arrived at Mrs. Peterson's house directly from her overnight shift, still wearing her waitress uniform and looking exhausted but proud as she embraced her son. "I got calls from customers at the diner who recognized you from the news," she told Mason, her eyes welling with tears. "Mrs. Hargrove left a $50 tip and told me to put it toward Lucky's care. Everyone's talking about what you did." The surgery lasted nearly 5 hours, with Dr. Martins inserting metal pins to repair Lucky's shattered tibias and carefully cleaning and suturing the wounds that covered his body. Mason and his mother waited anxiously in the clinic's small reception area, alongside Mrs. Peterson and, surprisingly, a small group of locals who had been moved by the story and wanted to offer their support in person. Even Mason's biology teacher had stopped by, bringing his missed assignments, but also assuring him that his absence would be excused, given the extraordinary circumstances. When Dr. Martins finally emerged from the operating room, his scrubs spotted with blood, but a smile on his tired face, the small crowd held their breath. "He made it through," the veterinarian announced, his voice carrying the weight of professional restraint, but unable to completely hide his own emotional investment in the case. "The next 48 hours will be critical, but he's a fighter. I've rarely seen an animal with such a will to live." While Lucky remained at the clinic for observation, Mason returned to school, surprised to find himself something of a local celebrity. Classmates who had never spoken to him before approached to ask about the dog. Teachers praised his compassion, and even the school principal announced at assembly that Mason exemplified the kind of character and community spirit the school hoped to instill in all its students. For a teenager who had always felt invisible, the attention was both overwhelming and strangely affirming. The viral nature of Lucky's story continued to grow, spreading from local news to regional broadcasts, and eventually catching the attention of a national morning show producer who contacted Mason about featuring the story. "They want to interview us via video call tomorrow," he told his mother incredulously, as they drove to the clinic for their daily visit with Lucky. "They're calling it The Teen Who Wouldn't Walk By, and want to highlight how social media can be used for positive change." Lucky's recovery proved to be as remarkable as the community's response to his plight. Dr. Martins had warned them that many dogs with similar injuries might give up, refusing to eat or engage with their environment due to trauma and pain, but Lucky seemed determined to defy expectations. By the 4th day after surgery, he was already attempting to lift his head when Mason entered the room, his tail thumping weakly against the padded surface of his hospital bed. "He recognizes you, Doctor," Martins observed with obvious wonder, as Lucky struggled to move closer to Mason, despite the casts encasing his back legs and the various tubes and monitors still attached to his body. "This is quite extraordinary, considering what he's been through. Most animals who've suffered abuse at human hands don't trust so readily." He paused, watching as Mason gently stroked Lucky's ears, the dog's eyes never leaving the teenager's face. "It's almost as if he knew from the beginning that you were his person." The question of where Lucky would go after his release from the veterinary hospital had been weighing on Mason's mind from the beginning. Their small rental house barely had enough room for him and his mother, with a landlord who strictly prohibited pets of any kind. Mrs. Peterson had offered her home without hesitation, but at her age, caring for a large dog with special needs would be a significant challenge, especially once the casts came off and Lucky required physical therapy to learn to walk again. "I've been thinking," Jennifer Reynolds said quietly as they drove home from the clinic one evening, the sun setting over the Blue Ridge Mountains in a spectacular display of orange and purple that seemed to signal new possibilities. "I spoke with Mr. Carmichael at the hardware store today. He mentioned they're looking for weekend help, and the pay is better than what I make at the diner for the same hours." Mason turned to his mother, confused by the sudden change in topic until she continued. "If I took that job on top of my regular shifts, we might be able to afford a security deposit on that little house on Maple Street. The one with the fenced yard." She kept her eyes on the road, but Mason could see her hands gripping the steering wheel tightly, a sign of her nervousness about what she was proposing. "The rent is only $75 more a month than what we pay now, and they allow pets." The implications of what his mother was suggesting hit Mason with the force of a physical blow. She was willing to take on even more work, more hours away from home, and the precious little rest she already got, all so that Lucky could become a permanent part of their family. "Mom, you already work too much," he protested, though his heart raced at the possibility. "I could get a job after school instead. Or maybe during the summer." "You focus on your studies," Jennifer interrupted firmly, the set of her jaw a familiar sign that her mind was made up. "That scholarship is still your priority. But this experience has shown me something important, Mason. Sometimes the right thing costs more than we think we can afford, but we find a way to make it work anyway. That dog needs you, and honestly, I think you need him too." The next 2 months brought challenges that tested their resolve, but also strengthened the unusual family they had become. Lucky's physical therapy sessions were grueling, with the dog often whimpering in pain as he attempted to put weight on his healing legs. There were infections that required additional treatments, nightmares that caused him to wake howling in terror, and moments when the psychological damage of his abuse manifested in unexpected fear, responses that broke their hearts all over again. But there were triumphs too. The first time Lucky managed to stand on his own for a few seconds, wobbling precariously, but refusing to give up. The day he wagged his tail enthusiastically when Dr. Martins entered the room, showing he had begun to trust other humans besides Mason. The afternoon he hobbled across Mrs. Peterson's living room to greet Jennifer when she arrived after work, as if he somehow understood the sacrifices she was making for him. By midsummer, they had moved into the house on Maple Street, a modest but charming bungalow with a yard that offered Lucky the freedom to continue his rehabilitation in the sunshine. The fundraiser had eventually collected over $12,000, enough to cover all his medical expenses with money left over, that Mason and his mother decided to donate to a newly established fund at Dr. Martins's clinic for other animals in need of emergency care. 1 year after that rainy April morning by the roadside ditch, Lucky bore little resemblance to the broken creature Mason had carried in his arms. His golden fur now gleamed in the sunlight as he raced across the local dog park, still with a slight limp but moving with a joy that seemed to radiate from every muscle and sinew of his rehabilitated body. The physical scars remained, patches where fur would never grow back, the slight deformity of his right hind leg that hadn't healed perfectly straight. But they only served to tell the story of his remarkable journey. Mason sat on a park bench, watching as Lucky enthusiastically greeted other dogs, his transformation from fearful abuse victim to confident, friendly companion, a testament to resilience and the healing power of love. "I still can't believe how far he's come," Mrs. Peterson remarked from beside him, her hands resting on the handle of the walker she now used to navigate longer distances. "Robert would have called it a miracle, but I think it's something even more special, the result of one person refusing to look the other way." The case against Lucky's former owners had brought another kind of justice and healing. Thanks to distinctive markings in the photographs Mason had shared online, a local farmer had recognized the dog as belonging to his neighbors, a fact he reported to the sheriff's department once Lucky's story went viral. The subsequent investigation had uncovered not only evidence linking them to Lucky's abuse, but also a puppy mill operation hidden on their property, where dozens of dogs were being kept in deplorable conditions. The morning show interview had indeed happened, expanding into a feature segment on animal abuse and the importance of reporting suspicious activities. Mason had spoken with a composure that surprised even himself, his words reaching millions of viewers. "I think we all have these moments in life where we have to decide who we want to be. Do we want to be the kind of person who walks past suffering because it's inconvenient to stop, or the kind of person who does something about it even when it's hard?" What Mason couldn't have anticipated was how Lucky's story would spark a movement in their small town and beyond. The Lucky Fund, established at Dr. Martin's clinic, had grown into a registered non-profit organization that provided emergency veterinary care for and abandoned animals throughout the county. Mrs. Peterson had donated her late husband's clinic building and equipment, finally ready to transform her grief into purpose by creating a space where volunteer veterinarians could provide services for animals in need. Jennifer Reynolds had discovered an unexpected talent for grant writing and non-profit management through her involvement with the Lucky Fund, eventually leaving her waitressing job to become the organization's first part-time administrator. The work still didn't pay much, but it offered regular hours and the satisfaction of building something meaningful, a far cry from the exhaustion of juggling multiple service jobs just to stay afloat. Mason himself had changed in ways both subtle and profound. The shy teenager, who had once moved through the world trying to attract as little attention as possible, now spoke confidently to community groups about animal welfare, led volunteer training sessions, and had even testified before the state legislature in support of stronger animal cruelty laws. His college scholarship had been supplemented by an additional award for community service, recognizing the ripple effects of that single decision to stop on a rainy morning. Lucky, however, remained at the center of it all, not just a survivor or a mascot, but a living embodiment of what becomes possible when compassion overcomes indifference. He had developed an uncanny ability to identify the most fearful rescue animals brought to the clinic, approaching them with a gentle patience that seemed to communicate understanding of their trauma. Veterinarians and volunteers alike marveled at how dogs who responded to no one else would often accept comfort from Lucky, as if recognizing a kindred spirit who had walked the same difficult path. "You know what still gets me?" Mason said to Mrs. Peterson as they watched Lucky playfully chase a butterfly across the grass, his movements fluid and joyful despite the permanent reminders of his past. "I almost walked past him that day. For about 5 seconds, I actually considered pretending I hadn't heard anything and just continuing on to school." The admission still filled him with shame, the knowledge of how close he had come to making a completely different choice. Mrs. Peterson's weathered hand came to rest on his, a gesture of understanding from someone who had seen enough of life to know its complexities. "But you didn't walk past, Mason. That's the only part that matters in the end. Not the moment of doubt, but the decision that followed it. One person doing the right thing can change everything. Lucky is living proof of that, and so are you."